What we're going to do now is actually go in and create a new class, and then we're going to show you in Objective-C how you use that class inside of the application. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to come over here to my application. We're going to right click and we're going to tell it to create a new file. And then from here we're going to go to the Cocoa Touch and we're going to select that we want to create an Object-C class. So we're just going to select that option. We're going to tell it to go to next. And then the next thing that happens here is it wants to know what we want to call this particular class. And you can call it anything you want. And then what you want the subclass to be. Now, as I mentioned, an NSObject is actually the base class. So in this case, I'm telling it that I want the most basic class you can create, which again is only going to have an allocate and a init and a description function or method that's applied to it. It's a very, very basic class that we're actually going to create first. So we're just going to go ahead and tell it next, and we're just going to leave the test view for the name. And then it wants to know where we want to save the app, and then whether we want it to be part of the group for test app. We can also create inside of the directory, and in an earlier video I was talking about organizing our code. We can go in and actually select a new folder if this is part of a new group of files that I want to keep separated from everything else. I can create a new folder and save it inside of that folder. In this case, I'm just going to leave it in the main folder because this app's not going to get that big. So we're just going to tell it to create the file. Now, what happens inside of Objective-C is it creates a .h and a .m file, and I'm going to try to explain to you exactly what the difference is. So the .h file has what Objective-C refers to as an interface, and all interfaces are going to have the add interface, and then the at end is going to be the end of that particular interface. Now, in the interface section, what we're doing is we're defining, you can kind of think of it as a template or as a contract that says that, you know, this particular class is going to have and is going to be made up of these particular things. But this is not where we actually write our code. This is just where we're going to go in and define what this thing is going to be capable of. And then in the .m file, this is the implementation section. And again, you got an add implementation and an add end that represents the end of that implementation. And this is where we're going to actually physically write the functions themselves. Now, the reason for having a .h and a .m file is the .h file is what we actually include into other sections. You can see here that this is importing the foundation.h class or the file. So this .h file is the contract. This is everything that Foundation can do. And then within the Foundation section, there is a .m file that actually has the implementation of all of these things. So Objective-C, when we created that, automatically created our .h and .m, so you don't really have to worry about too much of that. So we're going to start out here in our .h file, and the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to declare a couple class variables. So we want to actually come in here and create some variables that are going to be related to this specific class. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to put an open and closing braces here so that we can put all of our variables inside of these braces. This is just the way that they do the variables. So inside of here, what we'll do is we'll just keep this simple. We'll create an NS integer object. And again, these are not the same thing as an int or a string or a char or whatever you're creating as a native type C variable. These are actually Objective-C variable types, and they are actually objects, just like you get, you know, if you were to create a class like we're doing here. So the NS integer is not the same thing as an int. By the same token, I want to create an NS string. This is not the same thing as a character array. This is a unique thing for Objective-C. Now, all of the strings, when we create an NS string, we actually have to create this as a pointer. So we're going to go ahead and declare that as a pointer. Now, we have our integers. Now, in other languages, what we would do is we would have, an instance of this class, and we would say the instance name dot J1 equals whatever. Well, in Objective-C, we actually have to have what's called setter and getters. We have to actually define, and the next video I'm going to explain to you another way to do this, but we're going to do it the long way here. So in order for me to set the NS1, or let's say the J1 variable, I need to have a setter. So to do that, you're going to start off the class method with a minus sign, which the difference, you can have one of two things here. You can have a minus sign or you can have a plus sign. The plus sign basically says that I'm going to create a method that you can call even if you don't have an instance of this class. It's going to always be there. It's going to be shared across all instances of this particular class. It's referred to as a class method. If you put a minus sign, then you are basically creating an instance method, and that's what we want to do here. We want to only set J1 for the particular instance of the class that we created, and I'm going to do that in just a minute, so you'll see exactly what we're doing. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to set this particular variable. Now, to do that, I'm not going to return anything. So we're going to tell it that we've got a void return type, so nothing is going to be returned to this particular method call. And then we're going to give it set, and then we're going to give it the name of the variable that we want to set. So I'm going to say username. Now, set on a setter, it always starts with set and then the name of the variable. And from what most people do, they capitalize the actual variable name. It's not actually a requirement, but it's just something they recommend. Do whatever you want to do there. The next thing we want to do is we've given it our method name. Now we need to tell it what type of variable this is that we're going to send. So this is going to be an NS string. And then remember that the NS string actually has to be a pointer. So we're going to put a pointer inside of here. So we're going to be passing in to set username a pointer to a string. And then we're going to call it locally new username. And then we're going to put a semicolon because we're not actually defining the method here. All we're doing is putting what the method parameters are. We're going to define the method over in the implementation next. So the next thing I want to do is I want to be able to get that information back out. Now, to get it, we're going to actually have to return an NS string again, except it's going to be a pointer. And then we're going to name the getter the exact same thing as the variable name. So we're just going to tell it username. So that is how, and we don't have any parameters that are going to be passed to that. So it's just the type that we're going to return and then the actual method name itself. And whether you put a space there or not isn't important. I just like to do that. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing for the integer value. So we're going to come in here and we're going to tell it that we're going to have a return type of void. This is going to be set J1. We're going to pass it in an NS integer. And we're going to call this new number. And then we're going to have a setter for that particular, a getter for that particular item, and it's going to return an NS integer, and it is going to have the same name as the variable name. So what we have done here is we have defined our interface. We've told it that we have two class variables or two instance variables. One of them's an NS integer, one of them's NS string. We got two functions, a setter and a getter for the username, and a setter and getter for the actual variable J1. So the next thing we want to do is we want to actually implement these functions. So what I'm going to do is, to make this simple, is I'm going to copy these functions. So I'm just going to hit Command copy, and then we're going to go over here to the implementation, and we're going to click here, and I'm just going to paste those variables or those methods into this section. Now, these are not valid over here because you never actually end a function or a method call with a semicolon. We actually want to have the implementation of that method. So we're just going to get rid of the semicolons off the ends of these guys. and we're going to put our opening closing brackets to make it an official method. So what we've done now, and you'll notice there's some warnings here, and that's because these guys are supposed to be returning something, and there's nothing there to return. So what I want to do is we're going to tell it to return. Well, what is this going to return? It's supposed to return it in a string, and if you remembered, it's called username. And as you start typing, it actually will fill out everything for you. And so that is our return statement for that guy. And then we're going to come down here and tell this to return J1. And so those two methods are done. So now we have two getters that are done and ready to actually use in the code. And you can have as many spaces and things in here as you want. I typically like to space them out a little bit so I know what everything's doing. Now, I'm not writing comments and things in here. That's something else that you would normally want to do so that you can keep everything straight. Now, this particular function is a little bit different because we're actually passing in a variable. It's an NSString type called new username. Well, what is the goal of this particular function? Well, the goal is to set the local variable, which we called username, equal to new username, which is the local variable that we just created. So new username only has scope inside of this method, and username is our class variable. And notice I'm not having to put self or this or anything like that for this particular method or this particular variable. And that's because Objective-C already knows that it is an instance variable, and it knows what's going on here, so we don't have to actually do the self and other stuff that you do in other languages. And then here we want to do the same thing by setting J1 equal to, and then this one is called new number. And so now we have written our class, and we have our .m implementation file done, and we have our test.h interface done. So the next step is to actually use this class. So let's go over here, and we want to go to main.m. And the first thing is, in order to use this, we have to import it. So we're going to come over here, and actually what we could do is go back over to our test.m, and we can just copy this particular import that we had here, because notice that the implementation actually imports the .h file into it. So we'll just copy that. We'll come over here, and we'll paste it here. And the primary thing to note here is that this has the arrows on the ends of it, the greater and less than sign. That's because those particular, whoops, I'm not sure what it did there. That's because this particular library interface is actually part of the Objective-C libraries. So it's a little bit different than our class. In our class, we put double quotes around it. All right, so the next thing I want to do is I'm just going to get rid of some of this stuff that we had created earlier, and we're going to create an instance of that particular class that we had created. So the main thing that we're trying to do here is we're trying to come in here and create an instance of our new class so that we can actually use it. So to do that, we're going to do basically the same thing that we had done earlier. We're going to tell it that the name of our class is TestView, so we're going to create a type variable of TestView. It's a pointer, so we'll call it a TV for TestView. And we're going to go ahead and initialize it. So we're going to go ahead and do our typical test view, and then we're going to tell it to allocate, and then we're going to tell it to init. So now we actually have a test view variable, a local instance of that particular variable called TV. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set the username to whatever we want to set it to. So unlike other languages where you would do a TV dot username, here you're going to do an Objective-C method call, and the class that we want to work with is TV. The method that we want to call is called set username, and as soon as you type set, you've got the item, and it tells you that you're going to pass it a string. So we're going to do our string like we were talking earlier, and we'll just say we'll call it let's see, actually we do it this way, and we'll just say Glenn, and close, and there. So that is our method call to actually set. We're calling the set username and we're passing it Glenn. And let's go ahead and set the J1. So again, we're working on the TV. We're going to call set, and notice we've got the different values that we have down there, and there's set J1, and we're going to pass it a 3. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to actually tell the system to print, and I'm just going to use this particular thing that we had here for the NSLog, but we want to print, and I'm going to tell it to print TV. That's the class instance that we want to work with, and I want to have it actually print the username. So we'll just tell it username, because remember our getter that we had created earlier actually was called username. It was the same name as the variable that we had created. And just to show you that real quick, we have our username, and this is going to return the actual username field, the local variable called username. So again, we created an instance of our variable called TV. That's our test view class. So this is our instance. We have the blueprint of the class, which is our .h and .m files, and this is an actual car or whatever. This is the instance that we created that we're going to work with. So then we have our method calls to set the username, to set the J1, and then we are just going to print the username itself down here when we make the method call or the function call to NSLog. So what we have done here is we created a class, told it what the implementation and the interface looked like, and then here we have actually created an instance of it. So if we go ahead and run this application, it should start up our iPhone app, and we don't really care about the app. We're more interested in the NSLog, but this should print Glenn in the NSLog when it comes back here. So we've succeeded in building, and it should pull up the app here, and you can see here that it has actually printed Glenn to the log screen. So it correctly did exactly what we wanted to do.